Hello and welcome finally to another video. It has been far too long since I've actually recorded anything. Uni work has been a little bit over the top at the moment and has taken over my life the last few weeks, but we are finally recording something, and it is very similar to my Aggregate races episode of the 2020 season, except I'm looking at the 2012 season, 9 years ago. Now I do have to give a big shout out to the commenter Elliot, who left a comment on a previous video a couple of months ago suggesting this whole aggregate idea to me, and I basically ran it on the 2020 season as I had no idea if it was actually going to be any good, and it really wasn't at all. However, I hypothesized that it could be better in a more sort of competitive season, which is why I chose 2012. Unfortunately, my database of race lap data only goes back to 2012 as of yet, so this is as far back as I can go, and from 2012 onwards it wasn't particularly competitive in the world of Formula 1. So let us begin with today's episode, and we jump on in with the aggregate races. So what exactly are they? So let's pull up a small little example. We have a Grand Prix and it gets red flagged at somewhere in the middle. And in this red flag period, we have gaps between 4 drivers, A, B, C and D as follows. Driver B is 5 seconds behind, driver C 7.5, and then driver D 11 seconds behind the leader before the red flag on the racing lap before the red flag came out. Then what would normally happen in nowadays Formula 1, they would go back round on the track, they would line up for a standing start and they would restart the race, and the race would end at the checkered flag. And in this example, driver B came away with the victory ahead of driver C, D, then A by the corresponding gaps on the right. Now, like I said, in the normal realm of Formula 1 that has been for about 2 decades now, this is where the race would have ended. It would be classed as sort of 2 separate races, and this is all it was. However, in the most notable example of aggregate races being used in Formula 1, Japan at 1994, this was not the case. They did an aggregate of both of these races. Essentially, it was race 1 and essentially race 2, and they wanted to try and keep the advantages of race number 1 and the advantages that that driver had earned in race 1 and carry them over to race 2. So if I head back over to my example, we see that driver B has a 5-second deficit to driver A before the red flag. So they would have to overcome that 5-second gap over driver A to stand a chance at beating them in the aggregate. And as we can see, driver A is 10 seconds behind after the red flag, which means that when we take the aggregate of these two, driver B beats driver A by 5 seconds, and then the aggregates are worked out for everybody else and everyone is ordered accordingly. Now, however, I've had to make a small little tweak with this as there aren't a lot of red flags that appear in Formula 1, so I've decided to take full safety cars. As there was only full safety cars back in 2012, there was no VSCs. So whenever a full safety car is called, I will take the gaps of that race before, the lap before the safety car, the green flag lap beforehand. I'll take those gaps as race number 1 before the safety car happened, and then the gaps at the very end of the Grand Prix, or if there are 2 safety cars in the race, the gaps before the second safety car, and then the gaps at the end of the Grand Prix, and do an aggregate of those different sections. And so heading back to the data, and at the end of our little example, we can pull up the calendar of the 2012 season. So there were 20 races this year. Now, splitting these up between the races of 2012 without a safety car or red flag on the left, and then races with a safety car or red flag on the right, we can split them up accordingly. There were only 9 races that had either a safety car or a red flag, compared to the 11 that didn't. And comparing this to 2020, that is absolutely crazy. By about race 3 or 4, we'd had pretty much all safety cars in 2020, as opposed to 2012, where we didn't have many at all. Now, it does mean that for 11 races of this season, there will be no effect on the championship whatsoever. There are only 9 races, less than half of the 2012 season, that will be affected. So let's just remind ourselves of what happened in the 2012 season. Here is the official positions table, or at least my official positions table for the 2012 season. We had these 7 different race winners in the first 7 races, with Alonso being the first repeat winner after winning the European Grand Prix in Valencia. And then of course we had Vettel winning 4 races in a row near the end of the season. And then if I just pull up the points table over the top of that, there was just 3 points in it at the end of the season. It went down to the last Grand Prix in Brazil. There was then a chunky 74 points gap to Kimi Raikkonen actually in the Lotus in P3, with just 2 points separating the McLarens and Webber down in P6. However, if I just pull up the aggregate positions table, we see, well, honestly, not a great deal of difference. The only major difference is in Malaysia. Fernando Alonso did not win the Malaysian Grand Prix, it was Lewis Hamilton, according to the aggregate races and the way of calculating that. We still had 6 different winners in the first 6 races, but come Canada, it was Lewis Hamilton who became the first repeat winner, and not Fernando Alonso. However, after that point, all the races were near enough the same. There were just a couple of minor positional changes. So if I just shrink this table down on the left, and then we pull up the regular season's positions on the right, you can sort of compare and contrast which ones are which. So for instance, in Abu Dhabi, Sebastian Vettel in the regular season got P3, however in the aggregates he was P5. Alonso ended up with 2 extra P2 finishes in the regular season compared to the aggregates. So honestly, not a great deal of change whatsoever. And then if we take a look at the points table for the aggregate seasons, we see that it is still Vettel leading Alonso, Raikkonen, the 2 McLarens, Webber and Massa. However, the points gaps are ever so slightly different. Vettel just 1 point away from his original points tally, but now 15 clear from Fernando Alonso. And once again, if I shrink this down into the left and pull up the regular season on the right, we can see that on who's the first driver to change? It is actually Nico Hülkenberg swapping with Sergio Perez. But again, not a great deal of change has happened whatsoever. But now we're just going to take a look at those 9 races that did change under the aggregate races sort of rule. And the first one was actually race number 1 in Australia. The regular leaderboard is here on the left. I've also taken the time to sort of bulletproof my code a little bit more, as 2020 I rushed it ever so slightly. It didn't show who was DNF'd, it didn't show who was lapped. Some of the gaps were a little bit incorrect as well, but this one, it is 100% correct, shows who is lapped and by how many laps, as well as who failed to finish. But if I just pull up the aggregate table on the right, we see that the top 5 stays the same, and the only positional change comes from Kimi Raikkonen getting past Kobayashi, and then also Ricciardo slipping outside of the points, which is a fairly insignificant position change. The only one that comes within the points is Kimi Raikkonen and Kobayashi. And you can also see that we've gone from a 50-second spread between first and last to a 146-second spread between first and last. That has almost tripled. And then the second race which changed was Malaysia, and the only race this season that would have had a different race winner. And that was, of course, Lewis Hamilton, who had a mega first opening stint in the pouring rain of Malaysia, as the safety car, or the first safety car, came out very early on in the Grand Prix. Perez slipped from P2 down to P4. There were also some other positional changes further down the points. Schumacher managed to boost himself further up. Hülkenberg also moved further forwards along with Verne, and Senna slipped all the way outside of the points. Now, Malaysia is what I would like to have seen from every single race that had an aggregate. However, most of them were like Australia. There were very, very few positional changes. And so we move on into the next pair of races, and we start with Monaco, which was won by Webber, then Rosberg, Alonso, Vettel, all extremely, extremely close. And we pull up the aggregates, and it is still Webber, Rosberg, Alonso, Vettel, Hamilton, Massa. The first positional change comes from Hülkenberg getting past Di Resta, and then Raikkonen also getting past Di Resta. The top 6 stay exactly the same, ever so slightly more spread out. And then the next race to change was the European Grand Prix, in which Alonso came away with a victory in the regular leaderboard from Raikkonen and Schumacher, one of the best podiums of all time. And actually, as a quick little side note, the podium that had the most concurrent championships on it at the time they were there. 7 for Michael Schumacher, 1 for Kimi Räikkönen, and 2 for Fernando Alonso. That is 11 total championships. 10. How can I not add up to 10? However, theoretically, we could have had a 14 championship podium, as there is one instance where Schumacher, Prost, and Senna all stood on the same podium, only once. However, at the time, Schumacher hadn't won any of his championships, so it would have only been single digits worth of championships. Just a nice little side note and something completely pointless and unrelated from today's video. But if we take a look at the European aggregate leaderboard, we see that it is still Alonso from Räikkönen. However, Hülkenberg in the Force India would have got his first podium ahead of Schumacher, Webber and Rosberg. There are also a few other minor positional changes down in the lower reaches of the top 10. And then we head on into the next race that changed, and that was Belgium. We of course had the insane pile-up caused by Romain Grosjean, earning him a race ban in the next Grand Prix. Button came away with a victory, 13 seconds ahead of Vettel, then Räikkönen, Hülkenberg, Massa, etc, etc. And in the aggregate, it was, well, exactly the same. The only positional change came from De Resta getting past Ricciardo. And then the next race to be influenced by this aggregate idea after Belgium is Singapore, a race that almost has a 100% safety car record. Sebastian Vettel won from Jenson Button, Fernando Alonso and Paul Di Resta. However, the aggregate leaderboards, Di Resta gets past Alonso, a significant positional change. Di Resta ended up with his first podium and also Force India's second of the season as well. If there were aggregates, Force India would have had 2 podiums this year. There were also some other minor positional changes in the lower reaches of the top 10, with Webber getting past Perez and Massa. And then moving into the next influenced races by this aggregate idea, we head to Japan, where Vettel came away with a victory from Massa, Kobayashi, the 2 McLarens, Räikkönen, Hülkenberg, Maldonado and Webber, with the aggregate season looking a bit like this. Vettel from Massa from Kobayashi, the 2 McLarens, Räikkönen, Hülkenberg, Maldonado, and then Ricciardo, the only positional change of this Grand Prix. And then the penultimate race to change under this aggregate idea is Abu Dhabi. The 2012 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix famously won by Kimi Räikkönen, only just from Fernando Alonso and Sebastian Vettel, with the aggregate leaderboard looking a bit like this. Vettel actually slipping down to P5, which was actually crucial for the aggregate season's championship, otherwise he would have won the championship in Abu Dhabi. And then there were also some other significant positional changes within the lower reaches of the top 10 as well, as Schumacher managed to move himself forward, Kobayashi slipped back a bit, he swapped with Massa, and also Senna fell outside of the top 10. And then we head on into the last race that was influenced by this aggregate idea, and that is Brazil. Button from the 2 Ferraris from Webber, Hülkenberg and Vettel in the regular leaderboard, and then in the aggregate it was Button from Hülkenberg, from Alonso, and then the 2 Red Bull cars. So Force India under the aggregate idea would have had 3 podiums, and Hülkenberg would have actually had 2 in this year. And there we go, there is the entire 2012 season run under this whole aggregate race idea. Thank you once again to Elliot for suggesting this video, very, very appreciated. And always, if you have any of your own ideas for statistical videos, please let me know in the comments below, and I will make sure to do my best to try and turn those into a video. However, it's going to take its sweet little time, as university work, like I said at the beginning of this video, is stacking up, and that does take priority for the time being. But when the summer comes, after May, I can actually start bashing out a couple more videos, and maybe after a few deadlines as well. But also, if you're interested in any of the F1 merch that is behind me, either the Max Verstappen cap, the Suzuka track map as well in the plastic black, or anything that's inside the January 2021 season preview crate from Drive Crate, check out the video of my unboxing in the card in the corner. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.